This is the terrifying story of the USS Indianapolis. The year is 1945, and on March 31st, the 1,196 men aboard the USS Indianapolis, captained by Charles McVay, are en route back to the United States after an unaccompanied mission during World War II to deliver the atomic bomb that would later be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By unaccompanied, this means with no naval backup or submarine escort. They were completely alone in enemy waters, with orders to deliver the atomic bomb. Shortly after midnight on a dark, calm night, the Japanese Imperial Navy spot an enemy within their territory. They fire 6 torpedoes in their direction, and 2 out of the 6 torpedoes hits the USS Indianapolis. The impact from the torpedoes ultimately sunk the ship, leaving some of the most horrifying tales in history to follow. A number of men lost their lives in the fire from the explosion. The remaining men, amidst unimaginable chaos, were scrambling to figure out what to do when the ship began sinking, taking the crew with it. At this point, all surviving members are told to abandon ship. Now, let's take note of the fact that all of these men were extremely young, roughly between the ages of around 17 to 20 years old, and were not trained in any abandoned ship procedures whatsoever, nor were they trained to survive in the water. This is a really interesting fact about the US Navy back in the 1940s and prior, that it was not a requirement to know how to swim to join the Navy and go to war on ships in the ocean, surrounded by water. 300 men were left to tumble into the oil-ridden water, just dropping like ants on a stick. It took 10 minutes for the ship to sink, leaving every man for himself alone in the darkness in the middle of the ocean. 400 men went down with the ship that day, and 880 men were stranded across 25 miles of wide open ocean. The badly wounded succumbed to their injuries within the first 8 hours or so, but many held on for way longer. The men that didn't have a life jacket held on to those that did, and they were all treading water, doing their best to stay afloat random pieces of debris from the ship. Thankfully, a lot of them knew how to swim, but a lot didn't, again, as this wasn't a requirement in the Navy back in the 40s. I haven't even gotten to the sharks yet. You have to see part 2. This is part 2 of the terrifying story of the USS Indianapolis. Let's go. Around 300 surviving crew members of the USS Indianapolis are left stranded across 25 miles worth of open ocean, with nothing but themselves and debris from the ship to hold on to. For hours, they waited to be rescued. They didn't even expect to be spending a single night in the ocean, but it was soon obvious that no one was coming to save them, and they had no idea why. Hours turned into days, and as they waited for their rescue, desperate and starving in the ocean, the injured weren't surviving, and those that were suffering severe sunburn and saltwater lesions. Sunburn after a day in the sun is painful, let alone, I can't even imagine this. Because of the amount of injured men in the water, this attracted schools upon schools of sharks. Like hundreds and hundreds of sharks began circling the remaining men. They noticed that there was a particularly large shark which they named Charlie. After a couple of days, Charlie finally launched himself out of the water and ate one of the crew members. This sent the sharks into a frenzy, and they started plucking the men from the water one by one. With their already minimal means of survival, they were now being hunted by hundreds of sharks swimming beneath them. So why wasn't anybody coming to rescue them? For crying out loud? Well, because the USS Indianapolis was a captained ship, this meant that they had the authority to change course. So when the ship didn't arrive at its destination at 1100 hours like it was supposed to, they just removed the ship from the radar and figured they docked somewhere else. It was a classified mission after all. No one knew they were down. No one was looking for them. and it just so happened to be the only ship not accompanied by submarines in the event of a disaster. After 4 days, they gave up hope of being rescued completely until Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck and his co-pilot fly over the area in search of any sign of them, when miraculously they see a glimmer of light in the ocean, which just so happens to be the sunlight reflecting off their oil-stained clothes and hits him in the eyes. And as he dives towards the light, expecting it to be an enemy submarine, he sees boys. Soon after this, a signal is finally sent for a plane to come and pick up these boys after 5 days of treading shark-infested waters. I'm so sorry, this is all wrapped up in part 3. It's already up, go check it out. This is the final part to the terrifying story of the USS Indianapolis, the ship that dropped off the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Out of 1,196 men, including the captain, 400 men went down with the ship when it was sunk by enemy torpedoes. This was the only ship in history that was not escorted by submarine backup in the event of a disaster, as it was a classified mission, leaving roughly 800 men, boys, between the ages of 17 and 20, who didn't know how to swim, stranded across 25 miles of open ocean in shark-infested waters for 5 days. Be sure to go check out part 1 and 2, which explains the entire story. Or you can watch the movie. After days of treading water in the open ocean with no one coming to look for them, and hundreds of sharks beneath them plucking them one by one from the water. Despite going against orders, Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks managed to safely land a plane after they were spotted miraculously after a brief search of the area from the reflection of the sun off their oil-stained clothes. As many men as possible were pulled from the waters and strapped down to the plane, used as a life raft. Many lives were saved, but still some were lost, as around 50 men were eaten by sharks just trying to get to safety. Those that were in the water suffered severe sunburn and saltwater lesions after extreme sun exposure. They were suffering from injuries so horrible they had to be carefully extracted from the water by their life vests and their clothes, as their skin was starting to separate from their muscles. After 5 days, finally word was known that the USS Indianapolis had sunk. 1,196 officers and enlisted men, 317 half-dead survivors. These men were oblivious to the fact that they were dropping off the atomic bomb that weeks later would end the Second World War. Captain McVeigh was then court-martialed for negligence and was deemed responsible for the ship sinking. He was faced with 2 charges for the ship going down, and even Mr. Hashimoto, the director of the torpedoes that sunk the ship, fought alongside McVeigh in court, expressing that the charges were unjust and that there was no possible way that he could have been responsible for the ship sinking. The Navy looked for someone to blame, and it fell on the captain, who was played by Nicolas Cage in the movie.